I have great pleasure now in introducing Tania Burchardt. Tania is Director of the Centre for Analysis of Social Exclusion at the London School of Economics. I followed her work since I was a PhD student. She was one of the first people that really brought the capabilities approach to life for me, and her careful, methodical work around measurement frameworks is still something I look to as the kind of work I would like to do when I grow up, that kind of thing. She is co-chair of the Equality and Diversity Forum Research Network, has had editorial roles with the Journal of Social Policy, Journal of Poverty and Social Justice. She's a champion of bridging the gap between the academy and policymakers, policy shakers. She's operated as an advisor with the Department of Communities and Local Government, Department for Work and Pensions, the Office for National Statistics, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, Save the Children, among others. Tania is an expert on theories of justice, the capability approach, measuring inequality and applied welfare policy analysis. And Tania is joining us this evening to talk to her work, Child Poverty and Multidimensional Disadvantage, Tackling Data Exclusion. So thank you very much, Tania.
Thank you. Thank you, and thanks very much for that warm welcome. I'm very, very pleased to be here and to be part of the celebration of your fantastic programme. And I think, as you'll see, what I'm going to talk about today very much speaks to the importance of developing quantitative skills and putting them to good use. So this is joint work, as you see, with colleagues as listed on the slide there, and it's funded also by the Nuffield Foundation. So data exclusion, well, you might first of all think, well, hang on a minute, we've got more data than we know what to do with. We've got a wealth of household survey data. They're readily accessible, many of them through data archives. They're increasingly widely available. Similarly, administrative data, something that Nick in the back there knows a great deal about, possibly too much about, I don't know. The way in which many statutory organisations are now beginning to make their routine data that they collect as part of providing their services available for research purposes. Big data, as it's sometimes referred to. We've got oodles of official statistics. We've got a huge industry of independent analysis. So why could there possibly be anyone or anything that is still outside that range of wealth of data? Well, indeed there are. And in fact, those who are excluded, those who are missing from that wealth of data, are very often the most vulnerable. And those who we might most need to pay attention to in our work on excluded groups in terms of social exclusion, not just data exclusion. So what can we do about it? Well, one very reasonable response is to undertake qualitative research, detailed, in-depth work with small samples chosen specifically for the characteristics that are otherwise missed in the big picture of data analysis. And that is an extremely worthwhile approach. We can also lobby for improvements in the data infrastructure to say these groups are missing, we want them identified, we want them included in the data infrastructure. And that too is a very worthwhile endeavour. The third strategy is to make better use of what we have got to try and tackle this form of data exclusion. And it's that third strategy that I'm going to be focusing on today. But it's important to recognise that it's by no means the only strategy, and there are other important ways in which one can also, alternative ways one can tackle data exclusion too. So here's an outline of what I'm going to try and cover in the next half an hour or so. Forms of data exclusion, why it occurs, why it matters, strategies we can use to tackle data exclusion, and a little bit more detail using that third broadening out that third strategy of making better use of existing sources. And then 3 case studies from this project that I've been engaged in with Polly Vizard and Polina Obolenskaya and others. First on Roma, Gypsy and Traveller children. These are 3 groups of vulnerable and excluded children. Roma, Gypsy and Traveller children, children in recent migrant families, and children at risk of abuse and neglect. They're very different groups in all sorts of ways, and I'm not trying to make any claims for similarity across them, except for the common feature of data exclusion. And we've got different strategies that illustrate different approaches to tackle the data exclusion of each of those. And I'll finish by some reflections on the ways forward for tackling data exclusion. I should just mention that there is a fourth group in this project, which is young carers, so children who are looking after disabled parents often or other household members, who I'm not particularly going to talk about today, but if you're interested in that, do ask me or look on the website. And I guess given that I have got about half an hour and rather a large number of slides, it is just possible that one or other of these case studies will get skipped over rather fast as well, but we can always come back to those. So, forms of data exclusion. Well, the first and perhaps most drastic form of data exclusion is when individuals are not included in the sampling frame in the first place. So about 2% of the population in the UK is not living in a household, and therefore when we do our analysis on household surveys, they're not there. They're in prison, they're living in communal establishments of one kind or another, they're street homeless, for example. So that is one way in which data exclusion may occur. But they may not be in the sampling frame for other reasons, because mostly household surveys are based on a postcode address file, and there are many people who are not going to be there on to be sampled from a postcode address file. They may be mobile, moving around, or they may be undocumented, living here without legal documentation. A second form of data exclusion is where they are in the sampling frame, but the sample size is simply too small to pick up a sufficient number of cases for us to analyse them separately. And many surveys are not really powered to enable us to do disaggregated analysis on some of the small and particularly vulnerable subgroups who we might be particularly interested in. That becomes even more acute in the context of devolution, where we might want to look separately at England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, for example, in the UK context. Third form of data exclusion is where they're in the sampling frame and they're present in sufficient numbers in the sample, but we haven't asked the right questions in order to identify the group that we're interested in. For example, only recently have surveys started including questions on sexual orientation, sexual identity. So until that, we weren't able to identify lesbian, gay, bisexual people as a group to analyse separately, even though there were plenty of such individuals in our samples. Then finally, they may be in the sampling frame, present in sufficient numbers, have the relevant characteristics recorded, but we can't get hold of the data. So it's been collected, but it's not made available, it's not released. Or it may be in one data set, but not in another, and those data sets aren't linked. Or it may simply be that the analysis is restricted rather than the data themselves. So why does this occur? Why does data exclusion occur? Well, there are both pragmatic and political reasons for data exclusion. So first of all, some of the pragmatic reasons. Some of the groups that we might be interested in are hard to reach. Or to put it the other way round, those groups may find it hard to access official data sources, being part of official data sources. So, for example, the highly mobile populations, people who move very frequently from one place to another, it just is inherently difficult to capture those people in large-scale data collection exercises. Where we can, it may be very costly. For example, I mentioned about small sample sizes. Obviously, increasing sample sizes in order to allow this kind of small subgroup disaggregation has financial implications for the data collectors. There may be legitimate concerns about safeguarding confidentiality. So where there are small numbers or where it's a small minority group, it becomes that much more difficult, more sensitive to ensure that it's not going to be possible to identify the individuals within our data. It may be that there are questions that data collectors are reluctant to ask because they think it's going to disrupt the rest of the survey. They think it's going to imperil the response rates, for example. If we start asking people about characteristics they're not too happy to tell us about, for example, perhaps their migration status, then some data collectors are worried that that might just put people off the rest of the survey and we'd lose response rates. But there are also some political reasons for data exclusion, and I think, in a sense, these are the stronger driver of data exclusion. Most of these pragmatic concerns could be overcome if the political will to do so was there. Part of this is about social recognition, or lack of social recognition. So, for example, if we think about the transgender community, that's been a community that has very much been struggling for social recognition in recent years. But it's still the case that it's an under-recognised identity, and it's not reflected, therefore, in our data collection exercises for the most part. So lack of social recognition is the first barrier. Secondly, even where a group is socially recognised, it might not have any political priority. So I think migration status is an example of that I'm going to be saying a little bit more about later on. And although we like to talk about evidence-based policy making, there is also the phenomenon of policy-based evidence making. In other words, where a policy priority has been identified, it's remarkable how much resources suddenly get made available in order to collect data and evidence on that subject. And there may also be active resistance to data collection. So I was thinking on the train on the way up of an example where government was clearly actively reluctant to collect the information on a particular group because of what they feared they would find. And I think an example of this is the severer end of disability, the more severe impairments that people have, and the costs associated with living with those disabilities. I think there's no doubt that, for example, the Department for Work and Pensions, Department of Health, know that there are very substantial costs experienced by those people with some more severe impairments, but they don't want to collect that information because it would have huge implications for the benefits that are paid and for the services that are provided. So there may be active resistance to data collection. There may also be resistance by the group in question. Not everybody wants to be measured or identified or included in official data collection exercises. So that needs to be borne in mind as well. Okay, so one might say, all right, there's all these reasons why there are these small groups who we miss from our standard data collection exercises and data analysis. But maybe that's just how it is, and we should get on with the main job of analysing the data that we've got, the household surveys, the main stream of the population. So why do I think this problem of data exclusion matters? Well, the first is the reinforcing effect on social recognition. So I mentioned that as one of the barriers that can cause data exclusion, but I think tackling data exclusion can also be one way to put a group on the map and to say, here we are, these are the issues that we're facing, this is why we need some policy priority. That ties into advocacy, particularly by non-governmental organisations, by civil society. Civil society needs stats, facts and figures, quantitative data in order to begin building their case. That then may feed into policy and service delivery priorities, back to evidence-based policy making, to resource allocations, in particular, for example, when we're thinking about allocations to service providers like schools or local authorities, knowing the needs in that population, including the needs of some of these smaller, more vulnerable groups, is critical. Into how services and policies are actually designed to meet the needs of those groups, and then right through to evaluation. So I mentioned that there are all sorts of ways in which data exclusion occurs. Well, if we're working with existing sources, what can we do about some of these challenges? Well, here's some possibilities. If we're thinking about using the administrative data, for example, data produced by the Department for Education on, in England on the pupils that are going through the school system, a census of all the children going through the school system and their results and a number of other characteristics about them. That may help us to capture children who would otherwise not be included in the sampling frame because it's not dependent on a household-based sampling frame. It can also help because these administrative data sets tend to be vast. They're often censuses. They're often everybody who has been served by that particular arm of government or statutory body. So it can help if the issue is the sample size being too small. We can access secure data in particular environments. So these may be virtual laboratories now, virtual secure data laboratories, or actual physical secure data laboratories, where data that are not normally released can be made available to researchers under particular conditions. So that can help if the barrier is restricted access or restricted analysis. We can link within data sets. So that may help, for example, if you want to get results on a small subgroup. If you can pool across a number of years of a survey, 3 years of the Family Resources Survey, for example, can get you a large enough sample size to get underway. It can even help with the problem of characteristics not being recorded. For example, it may be that the characteristics of parents are recorded, and if we can link that to a child level record, we may be able to infer something about the household circumstances of that child, even if at a child level that information isn't recorded. We can link across data sets, and if we have time I'll show you an example of how that can help. And we can use sources that you wouldn't ordinarily think of for one purpose, for another purpose, in order to identify a particular subgroup or need. So onto my case studies. The first then, as I mentioned, is Roma, Gypsy and Traveller children, and we've tackled this using census data. So this builds on a huge volume of small-scale qualitative studies, many of them carried out with the cooperation of Roma, Gypsy and Traveller organisations in the UK. And it builds on headline statistics that have been already published from the England and Wales Census 2011 and by the Department for Education, just on the education of Roma, Gypsy and Traveller children, and a very limited amount of data also from the Department of Health. So our approach here is to try and build on that and extend using analysis of the census microdata. Before plunging into the data, let me just recap on how the political and pragmatic reasons for data exclusion apply in this particular case. In the case of Roma, Gypsy and Traveller children, of course, there has been a long history of discrimination and indeed persecution, not just in this country but across Europe. And that's had two profound effects. First of all, in terms of the lack of existing data. Indeed, 2011 was the first census that included a category for Gypsy and Traveller ethnicity as one of the pre-coded ethnic categories. But it has also produced a considerable degree of suspicion on the part of many members of the Roma, Gypsy and Traveller communities as to how official data will be used and a reluctance to engage with official data collection exercises. So it's a double-edged sword. Some parts of the population are also living in temporary or mobile accommodation or have no accommodation at all. They're a small population subgroup in many countries, although if we look across Europe, they are Europe's largest ethnic minority. And there are other reasons for non-response of Roma, Gypsy and Traveller families to surveys. In addition to the fear of persecution and their experience of discrimination and prejudice in the past, they also have low levels of literacy overall and may be engaged in activities that they don't particularly wish to report to the authorities if it's, for example, unlicensed forms of employment. So there are multiple reasons for data exclusion. And indeed, this lack of data has been cited by the Open Society Foundation as a barrier to effective policy development for this group across Europe. So the 2011 census for England and Wales, as I mentioned, and also in fact the census for Scotland, although we haven't analysed that, did include for the first time this pre-coded category. Now it's imperfect and it's subject to considerable criticism, not least because it's listed as a subgroup within the white ethnicity, and not all Gypsy and Travellers would necessarily see themselves as a subgroup of the white ethnicity. Moreover, there's no specific mention of Roma. There's no pre-coded category for Roma. There is simply a generic other please write in category. And for the purposes of this analysis, we've taken all those who indicate any form of Gypsy, Sinti, Roma, or similar identifications as part of this overall group. It gives us a sample in this 10% sample of households in the census, accessed through the Secure Research Service, of just over 2,000 Roma, Gypsy and Traveller children, RGT children, which equates to about 0.2% of the 0 to 18-year-old population. So these census data have got some advantages. The census, unlike most household surveys, made a significant effort to access individuals who were not in the standard postcodes. So they were not in addresses as commonly recognised. So there was a specific dedicated part of the census enumeration that worked with Gypsy and Traveller organisations to identify stopping places, traditional stopping places and contemporary, where enumerators were dispatched to try to include as many Gypsy and Traveller families as possible in the census data collection. So that's one important advantage of the census for this group over household surveys. It also, of course, gives us a large sample size. So even 10% of the sample, 10% of the census still gives us very large numbers to work with. It's nationally representative and it's an authoritative source, which matters in terms of the sorts of advocacy that one can achieve on the back of it. It's not going to be dismissed on the grounds of poor data quality by government officials in the same way that more community-based data collection exercises often are. However, we still have a significant problem of underreporting of Roma, Gypsy and Traveller ethnicity. So I mentioned the way in which the characteristic is listed underneath the white category. That's certainly one problem. But in addition, we know that some Roma, Gypsy and Traveller people are reluctant to self-ascribe as that ethnicity for all sorts of reasons. So there's underreporting of RGT. We don't know in which way that's likely to bias our estimates of the scale of disadvantage amongst this community. On the one hand, more, if one can say it, more integrated RGT who are perhaps better off may not particularly wish to be identifying their RGT ethnicity. On the other hand, some of the most disadvantaged who are perhaps not literate, who may have particular reason to be suspicious of the authorities, may be likely to be missed as well. We did a comparison of the Roma, Gypsy and Traveller 16-year-olds in the National Pupil Database with the RGT in the census, and it appears that the census sample are less well qualified than the National Pupil Database sample. So that's just one indication that it may be, in fact, a bias in the direction of there being more well-off RGT who are not identifying in the census, but that's fairly weak evidence. So that's just the disclaimer that needs to be displayed before I can show you these results. So we did a whole range of different analysis, but this is just a summary of some of the things that I thought I could talk through with you. So what we've got here is 4 different dimensions of deprivation for Roma, Gypsy and Traveller children aged 0 to 18, with the dark blue bars showing the results for Roma, Gypsy, Traveller children, and the pale blue all other ethnic groups looked at together. And I'll go through each one in a little bit more detail in a moment, but just to give you the broad picture, as you can immediately see, the Roma, Gypsy, Traveller children are 3 times as likely to be experiencing housing deprivation, 3 times as likely to be in households experiencing economic activity deprivation, twice as likely on health, and about 6 times in relation to education. So it's a pretty systematic picture of very big margins of disadvantage for the RGT children compared to other ethnic groups. So in terms of housing, what we're looking at in terms of deprivation here is living in overcrowded accommodation, in a non-self-contained dwelling, or an accommodation with no central heating. About a third of Roma Gypsy Traveller children are living in a caravan or some other temporary or mobile accommodation. So just over a third of RGT children, compared to less than 0.1% of all other children. So part of this housing deprivation relates to the type of accommodation. But even if we home in on those 2/3 of RGT children who are in settled accommodation, in flats or houses, they're still experiencing far higher rates of housing deprivation than other children from other ethnic groups. So 34%, if we just concentrate on those who are living in flats and houses, 34% are experiencing housing deprivation, more than twice the rate for other ethnic groups. So I think there's sometimes a sort of identification, a casual identification in our minds between Gypsy travellers and living in caravans. It is an important part of their lifestyle for some, but actually only a third of RGT children are living in caravans, and similar, the 2/3 who aren't are also extremely disadvantaged. In terms of economic activity deprivation, we're looking there at households where there is no one in paid work. And one of the interesting features of that from an RGT perspective is the significant importance of self-employment amongst those who are in work. So a much higher proportion of RGT families are dependent on self-employment for their income as compared to other groups. In terms of health deprivation, it's a compound indicator of children whose health is very bad, bad or fair, or who have a long-standing illness or disability that limits their activities a little or a lot. And as you can see, it's twice the rate amongst the RGT population. There's also very high rates of parental ill health and disability amongst these households, which can result in a sort of compound effect of adult and child disability. And then finally, in terms of education here, we're looking at quite an extreme indicator, which is no educational qualifications in the household. So for children aged 0 to 16, that's just parental education, but for 17 and 18-year-olds, that would include their own qualifications as well. The education inequality goes right through the whole spectrum. So this is at the extreme bottom end, looking at just no educational qualifications. But if we look right through to degree level education, we find the same disproportionality. So less than 6% of RGT children are living in households where someone has a degree, compared to 36% of children from all other ethnic backgrounds. Now, I've been lumping together children from all other ethnic groups for the purpose of simplicity here, but we've also in the paper got some breakdowns looking at different ethnic groups individually in comparison to RGT. And whilst on some individual indicators there are other ethnic groups who approach these levels of deprivation, there is none that equals these levels of deprivation on any indicator, never mind across the 4 indicators looked at together. So, for example, Bangladeshi community is the community with the highest levels of educational deprivation on this measure after RGT, but the rate there is only 30%, so half the level of the RGT children. So one of the particular features is the multidimensionality of this disadvantage. So it's the fact of not just being deprived on education, but being deprived really across the board. And so in this very simple index of account of the numbers of dimensions on which children are deprived, we can begin to see that disproportionality. So the purple bar, the purple section of the bar, children are deprived on 3 or 4 of those dimensions that I just showed you, and you can see that there's 10 times as many RGT children in that category as compared to other ethnic groups. So what are the implications of all of this? We did some further analysis controlling for demographic characteristics in order to see whether this was just a sort of compositional effect, composition of the population, and it perhaps won't surprise you to know that it isn't. So even after controlling for all other demographic characteristics of the household, RGT children are still at roughly 8 times the risk of multidimensional disadvantage. No one dimension explains the multidimensional disadvantage, so it's not as if you can just crack this by solving housing, for example, which is often thought to be the key to this policy area. In fact, parental education is the one dimension that seems most strongly predictive of risk on the other dimensions. The so-called settled population, so the population in houses and flats, have high levels of need, especially health needs. And it's clear that interventions need to take a whole family approach given the significance of the parental education as well as the child's. Our second case was children in recent migrant families. And again, there are both political and pragmatic reasons for data exclusion. And a particular challenge here is that this is a very diverse population. So some migrants come through on a high-skilled visa, a high-skilled worker visa, may not be disadvantaged at all. Other people are coming through as undocumented migrants or asylum seekers. So it's a very diverse population, and if we aren't recording the characteristics or aren't analysing them, we may not be able to target services to support integration and address child poverty and disadvantage effectively at all. So our strategy was to look, in this case, at the Family Resources Survey and the Households Below Average Income dataset, which are linked together, in a secure access environment in order to access some variables that are not usually released in the end-user license version. We needed that in order to get the country of birth, the detailed country of birth information, not just UK, non-UK, in order to get robust standard errors for these relatively small population groups, and in order to get the date of arrival in the UK. So our definition of a recent migrant for this purpose, there's lots of debate around how you might define migrants and indeed recent migrants, but for the purposes of this analysis, we've defined a child in a recent migrant family as a child whose parent was born outside the UK and arrived in the last 10 years. It's important to note as a qualification there that means that the child themselves might have been born in the UK, but if their parents arrived recently, we're still thinking of them as a child in a recent migrant family. It's also the case that some of these parents will have subsequently acquired British nationality. So nationality and country of birth don't go exactly hand in hand, of course. So the advantages of this approach is that we get these additional records, which are very useful for analysing the circumstances of migrants. If we pool across 3 years, which is our approach here, we get a sufficient sample size to analyse. And again, because it's government data, we're getting the authoritativeness that goes along with that. On the other hand, it's not data of our own making, so it's limited in some key respects. We don't know why people have come to this country, so the labour force survey has a very interesting question about the reason for migration, but that's not included in the Family Resources Survey, unfortunately. So we don't know why people have come, and we don't know their actual immigration status. We don't know what particular rules they are subject to. We can't identify unaccompanied asylum seekers, so that's minors who come without a parent. If my colleague Polina Obolenskaya was here, she would tell you that working in a secure data lab over a long period is extremely restrictive. I don't know if any of you have got the experience of that, but So here's what we found. We've divided this here into 3 groups. Children whose parents were either born in the UK or have been here for more than 10 years. EEA recent migrants, so country of birth of the parent in an EEA country, arrived in the last 10 years, and non-EEA. And there's about 8% of children who have a recent migrant family. And about half of those children were themselves born outside the UK. The majority of them have no parent who's acquired UK nationality in that period. That's more the case for EEA recent EEA migrants, because of course there's less to be gained for them as things stand from acquiring UK citizenship as opposed to just retaining their EEA citizenship. And we've done further breakdowns of how long they've been in the UK. It's about half or going up to 2/3 for the non-EEA who've been here for the longer period, 6 to 10 years. Here's what it looks like in terms of poverty rates. So we've got 6 different measures of poverty and deprivation here. The top lines are relative low income measures, so that's below 60% of median household income, and they're after housing cost measures. I'm sorry, that's the top line is the orange one, which I've just described. The dashed one is what some people call an absolute poverty line. I prefer to call it an anchored poverty line. It just fixes the threshold at a particular year rather than allowing it to vary over time. Then we've got the before housing costs lines here, and then we've got the low income and material deprivation or severe low income and material deprivation lines there. And again, we've got our 3 migrant categories. So a couple of things to take away, I think, from this graphic. The first is that in almost every case, with the exception of this data point here, the non-EEA recent migrant family children are at higher risks of poverty than the EEA, who are themselves at higher risk than the UK-born long-term migrant families. But we can also see what a huge difference housing costs is making. So the jump from these purple and green lines, which are the before housing cost measures, to the after housing cost measures, is large. And it's much larger for our recent migrant families than it is for our UK-born and long-term migrants. So the gap between the lines increases for the recent migrants than for the UK. And further analysis indicated that the reason for that is because a large share of the recent migrants are in private rented accommodation. So the effect of housing costs is felt much more sharply for them in terms of their poverty risk than it is for the UK-born or long-term resident groups. That's the point I was just making about private renting. It's also the case that children in lone parent families, whether in migrant families or non-migrant families, of course have a higher risk of poverty. That's a familiar finding. But what I think we didn't know before is that lone parent status is especially strongly associated with a higher risk of poverty for non-EEA migrant families. So my colleague Isabel Schutt's done more work on that issue, and it seems that the entitlements that these non-EEA recent migrant families have are sometimes tied to the parent who becomes the absent parent. So when they've left the household, entitlements are lost because they were dependent or perhaps on a worker status, which exposes children in these lone parent families to particularly high levels of risks of poverty. Another very interesting result was about the interaction between skill level and poverty risk for migrants and non-migrants. So here we've looked at the parent who left education at the oldest age. If there are 2 parents, we take the one who's left older. Whether it was 16 and under, 17 to 20 or 21 plus. So you can think of this as sort of how much education they've got, their skill level, if you like. And again, we've looked at the blue line at the UK-born long-term resident, the EEA recent migrants, the non-EEA recent migrants, and this is risk of relative after-housing cost poverty. We can see that if we look at the graduates or quasi-graduates over here, it really doesn't make any difference to your poverty risk anymore whether you're a migrant or not. The difference in risk in poverty is really strongly associated for the low-skilled migrants. So when we're thinking about this population and we're trying to think about targeting services, targeting assistance with integration, we really need to be distinguishing between the high and the low-skilled pathways to migration, and it's that low-skilled group, and particularly the non-EEA recent migrants that we need to be thinking about. So what does all of this mean for how we might go about tackling data exclusion, which I hope at least I have persuaded you is something that should be of concern, at least if we're interested in these issues of poverty, deprivation and disadvantage. So I think the first strand of tackling data exclusion is to build the political will to do something about it. That might be through increasing social recognition, so working with civil society groups to lobby for recognition of particular social groups. It might be, for example, through the work of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, who have, within their most recent version of their measurement framework, specifically highlighted what they're calling vulnerable groups and pressurising for improvements in data infrastructure to address the needs of those so-called vulnerable groups. Similarly, the Children's Commissioner for England has got a major programme underway, identifying, I think they've got a list of 32 different groups of children who they regard as at heightened risk of disadvantage. And there are many, many data gaps in relation to those groups. But simply having that list and identifying red flags, these are the groups who we need to do more to try and include, is part of that process, I think, of building the political will to do something about it. And similarly, the ONS inequalities data audit. We can also move forward in building the data infrastructure. And I think there's considerable hope here. There's been a lot of change even over the last 10 years in the data that are available. So this is an improving picture. Initiatives that expand and improve access to administrative data, like the Administrative Data Research Network, very, very valuable and important. We can lobby for additional questions to be included. So one of the matters arising from this project is to lobby for the inclusion of that question from the Labour Force survey on reasons for immigration to be included in the Family Resources Survey, because that would really enhance, in a very low-cost way, the analysis that we're able to do on that group in the FRS. Similarly, for booster samples to get us more power in our analyses, such as the ethnic and migrant booster sample in the Understanding Society panel. And we can try to create better data linkage by more intelligent use of identifiers that can enable us to link across data sets, always assuming, of course, that appropriate consents are in place. And perhaps most importantly of all, we can build the quantitative data analysis skills that enable people to make use of this wealth of data once it's actually available. So really, it's over to you. Thank you very much.